Welcome to the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from an unapologetically leftist perspective. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers. I'm recording from Bloomington. I'm a working class white guy and, sometimes reluctantly, a Democrat. Once upon a time, that was automatic. Thomas Jefferson and later Andrew Jackson built a party aimed at representing the common man. And listen, I know that comes with 47 metric shit tons of racial baggage that I hate to just gloss over, but for the purposes of this conversation, it is not a stretch to say that working class white voters made up the base of the Democratic Party for over 150 years. But, beginning in the late 1960s and culminating in the Reagan Revolution, white working class voters abandoned Democrats. Now, this group constitutes the base of the Republican Party, particularly the Trump MAGA wing of the party. How did that happen? Conventional wisdom chalks this up to racism, a backlash to the gains of the civil rights movement. But deeper inspection reveals far more nuance. My guest today embedded herself in multiple working class Rust Belt communities, talking to local leaders and regular folks alike, to find out what motivates them, what drives their voting habits, and why towns with ostensibly similar profiles might vote differently. Stephanie Ternullo is an assistant professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago in 2022. Her first book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics, was published in 2024 and shows how place intersects with race, class, and religion in shaping the rightward turn across the industrial heartland. It draws on a comparative study of 3 white post-industrial cities during the 2020 presidential election to argue that we can best understand the reddening of the American heartland by examining how local organizational contexts have sped up or slowed down white voters' turn toward the right. Dr. Ternullo's research has appeared in the American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, American Journal of Sociology, Studies in American Political Development, Social Forces, Perspective on Politics, and Social Problems, and has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. In this conversation, we will dive into her book looking at the misrepresentation of working class concerns, relational versus ideological politics, Democrats' moral blind spots, the decline of institutions, media nationalization, and elites as a unifying opponent. Now, before we jump to the interview, do please consider supporting Who's Left with a paid subscription. This is an independent media project. I do not paywall any content, and I don't rely on advertising. Only individuals like you sustain this endeavor. So please, if you find value in my work, go to whosleft.us and subscribe at the paid level. It's only $5 a month or $50 a year to help me write more, research more, and organize more. Not ready for a long-term commitment? You can throw a one-time contribution in my hat on Cash App or Venmo. Links for those are in the show notes. I would like to dedicate my full time to you, this project, and Indiana's future, but I need your financial support to do so. Can't help financially right now? That's okay. There are other ways to help grow this community. By liking and sharing on social media, commenting, leaving reviews, providing feedback, and forwarding articles to your people. We are building a community of Hoosiers dedicated to making the state and its government work for all of us, not just the elite few. Follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and I'm personally at ScottRog78 on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, and Mastodon. Tell the others. Let's build a radically democratic Indiana together. Thanks again. Now, here's my conversation with Stephanie Ternullo. Hey, Dr. Stephanie Ternullo, welcome to the Who's Left podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I really appreciate you being with us. So, Miss Fancy Harvard professor, tell us what led you to write your book, How the Heartland Went Red.
There are a lot of reasons why I wrote this book. I think one of the big ones is that I think, like you, I've always kind of been curious about what's going on with working class politics in America today.
Hmm.
And a lot of that has to do with where I grew up and the conversations I would have with extended family growing up and the sorts of concerns that I would hear from, my uncles or my aunts, which you wouldn't even call maybe like political opinions, but just the things that they
Yeah.
worried about and talked about didn't really seem to me like they were well represented in the academic conversation about working class politics. And so that was one of the reasons why I wrote this book. It's what really sort of sparked my interest to begin with in the project.
Yeah. Can I ask where you grew up?
I grew up in Connecticut in a small town called Tolland.
Okay, so not exactly like, I guess, what you would consider the heartland in a,
Definitely not.
sort of the way we
The-
typically think of it, but small
yeah.
town America. Yeah.
Yes, I think I would say I was never in this project initially interested in the heartland or the Midwest. I found myself in the Midwest during graduate school. And so this became a project about the Midwest. But the months I spent, 5 years in the Midwest for graduate school in Chicago and several months in Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota for this book. And that was really, for me as a New Englander, that was my introduction to the Midwest, to the Heartland, whatever you want to call it. And it was a good introduction. I will always have the best memories of my time there.
So yeah, you were, living amongst us, as it were. Not, it's not like East Coast media or whatever. They swarm to Iowa every 4 years and, like,
Mhm.
in this diner sort of
Yeah.
thing, and think they're supposed to gain some sort of insight into our communities, in an afternoon. But sounds like you were really embedded.
Yeah, that was my goal. I think when you said that tension of that you put your finger on of the fact that I'm a New Englander. I'm from, you know, the East Coast. I now am at a place like Harvard. In so many ways, when I first arrived in these places, in these communities, I'm just totally an outsider, a weirdo. And in fact, like people would sometimes say to me, "You just don't look like you're from here." And I would be like, "Okay, cool, cool. Explain how." Often the way I was dressed was just like a dead giveaway. Um,
There's not
and
enough
so,
flannel going on here. Yes.
yeah. Um, so yeah. So in a lot of ways, I was really different, and I think that that made me want to work even harder to understand perspectives of people who are in some ways similar to me and in some ways really different from me, and to try and be aware of how my own sort of preconceived notions and my own background could be like influencing my perceptions of the people I was meeting and speaking to. And so, I don't know that I don't want to like pat myself on the back and say I always succeeded in this way, but one of the things that was most important to me in writing this book is like faithfully representing the conversations I had with people and showing them a portrait of their communities that feels recognizable. So I really do hope that I achieved that. And that was the goal. But you know, I'm always willing. The best compliment I ever get is when someone says, "Oh my gosh, I swore you were writing about my town in Wisconsin. Like that was my town." And I'm like, "It wasn't, but I guess it sounds a lot like the town you grew up in." That's a great compliment. Sometimes when people say this really doesn't sound like my Indiana town, for example, I'm definitely people who there's local experts and then there's me, and I'm not the local expert, right? I'm learning from the local expert.
Well, let's talk about the towns you profiled. There are three Midwestern towns. One in Indiana, one in Wisconsin, and one in Minnesota, right?
Yeah.
And what choose you to profile the towns you did?
Yeah. So, like I said, my interest in the project to begin with was understanding um, the sort of contemporary dynamics of white working class politics today. And so I wanted to interview people who are similar kinds of people, but that vote differently. And so to find those people, I ended up actually finding similar kinds of communities that in aggregate vote differently. So I found one community in Wisconsin that's voting very Democratic today, one community in Indiana that has been voting sort of very, very Republican since, at least at the presidential level, since the late 1960s, and one community in
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota that has sort of very recently switched from Democratic to Republican after 2016. And so um, all three of those communities kind of they have similar kinds of people live there. They have similar, not identical, but similar sorts of economies. They're dealing with a lot of the challenges that are increasingly common in post-industrial and rural contexts, like aging populations. Young folks are leaving. Uh, um, in two of my field sites, increasing problems with the opioid epidemic, um, broadly issues related to economic precarity, things like housing shortages, all of those kinds of things. So, in a lot of ways, these three places were very, very similar. And so, I wanted to understand, why is it that similar people living in places that seem similar on the outside are voting differently?
You in the book don't name these towns. You kind of
Yeah.
give them pseudonyms. What's
Yeah.
the reason behind that choice?
Yeah. It was an ethical and sort of methodological decision at the time. Um, so methodologically, I worried that, if I reached out to the mayor of one of these communities and said I'm conducting this
Mm,
study, and that mayor maybe wanted to run for House of Representatives next year, they might be less willing to have a frank conversation with me about what they thought about local politics in their community, because they would be identifiable in my book. So I thought that if I anonymize their community, that person would be more willing to talk to me and more willing to be honest with me. Um, and then I also was worried about the ethics of it. So all of my interviewees were promised anonymity. That's it's a sort of big difference between kind of academic research and journalistic research. We typically anonymize individual interviewees, although some people are changing that practice. And I worried that for some of my interviewees, if I didn't anonymize where they were from, you might be able to kind of figure out who they were. If you knew they were from this particular town
mm,
with
mm-hmm.
17,000 people, and I describe, meeting them at their house and this is their neighborhood, you might be able to figure out where they're from. Or if I describe kind of what they do for a living, you're really narrowing down your options there of who they are. So I worried about protecting their anonymity. I think in retrospect, I didn't need to do that to protect their anonymity. And I also probably didn't need to do it to get the mayors to talk to me. I'm working on a new book now, and I'm not anonymizing my field sites. But once you make that decision, when you start a research project, every person who participated in my project like signs an informed consent document where I explain how I'm going to protect everything they said to me and make sure that it remains anonymous and be respectful of their data in all the ways I was just describing. And so I couldn't change my mind later. I had to be faithful to what I'd agreed to. So yeah, and it is, in case you're wondering, I won't tell you what the towns are, but it is the first question I get asked anytime I talk about this book. And for that reason alone, I kind of regret the anonymity thing.
Well, in a way, it could be like a fun guessing game. It leaves some mystery to be solved, right? But these
Yeah.
are real towns. It's not like they're not an amalgamation of
No,
several little towns. These are like this is one place, and these are people in this one
three real
place that you talk
towns.
to. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So what's the kind of the big central theme running through your book? What's the overview of your main argument say? What do people typically understand about working class voters in red states and just in the Midwest?
Yeah. So, my main argument is basically that local organizations matter for heartland politics. They matter for understanding why so many Midwestern communities have turned to the right in recent years and actually in the past few decades. And they matter for understanding the few communities that have kind of remained in the Democratic coalition. And more specifically, I argue that having really politically mobilized unions has been a really powerful force in keeping a pretty small chunk of sort of white post industrial cities in the Democratic coalition. And the reason that so many of similar cities, one reason so many similar cities have left the Democratic coalition is because they lack those politically mobilized unions. And they either lack kind of any sort of local organizational force at all. They've experienced kind of broad civil society decline. Or in some cases, they do have other organizations, but those organizations tend to draw people to the right, namely organizations like churches.
Yeah.
And so this sort of uneven decline of unions and churches across previously industrialized cities in the Midwest has been a big reason to understand kind of the reddening of the heartland, as I say in the
Yeah.
title.
When I think a lot of I think when a lot of folks think of Heartland, they think, they're thinking farm, they're thinking rural.
Mm-hmm.
But even out here in a place like Indiana, that's not most of our population. I think only
Yeah.
like 2% of people actually work in agriculture. Um, so towns like the ones you profile are really more typical of what folks would like consider the heartland, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those definitions where I think people can put a lot into what the heartland means, but I'm really talking about these, I call them post-industrial cities. And really what I mean by that is just these cities, and I think they feel familiar to a lot of people. They're small, they're often small cities. They are largely concentrated in the north where manufacturing used to be the strongest in the United
Yeah.
States. And they used to be sort of based in industrial economies, often industrial economies related to agriculture. So maybe they had, a tractor manufacturing plant, for example.
Yeah.
But those industries formed the core basis of their economy or their economies for decades and decades. And depending on the nature of those industries, maybe starting as early as the 1950s or the 1970s, or perhaps not until the 2000s, those industries declined. And so the sort of economic foundations of those communities were transformed. And that has implications for people's politics, right? It has all these knock on consequences for who lives there. Like I said, young people tend to leave because they're looking for better employment. The population ages, these other social problems come to the fore. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the way that those communities deal with those problems of deindustrialization really shapes residents' politics. So one of my field sites in Minnesota has experienced, like I said, this kind of deterioration of civil society. And it's
Hmm.
that deterioration of civil society alongside these economic shifts that have left residents feeling really kind of like up shit's creek without a paddle, for want of a better phrase. That like, they've had to deal with this crisis, like a real crisis over the past 20 years, and that there's no sort of core stable leadership telling them, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to resolve this. Whereas in communities that still have these kinds of thriving local organizations like churches or unions, as in my other field sites, there are a consistent voice of organizational leaders saying the same things again and again about how to think about these social problems, how to think about revitalizing the economy and the community, and are actually making efforts to that end. And it's not to say that in this case where civil society has deteriorated, that there aren't people making efforts. There are so many people making efforts. I think once you kind of start looking for people who are trying to improve their communities, no matter where you are, You will find people who are doing the most thankless, hardest jobs ever. No one knows they're doing it. They're working so hard to fix what's going on that they see that's wrong. It's just that stability factor. It's just that lack of one consistent voice saying, this is what's wrong, this is how we fix it, and then doing that same thing day in, day out over years. When you don't have that like stable set of organizations, you lack that kind of consistency.
Yeah, I hear the word abandonment a lot. Like
Hmm.
folks feel abandoned
Yeah.
out here in the the industrial Midwest.
Yeah.
Like government isn't supporting folks like it used to.
Hmm.
Certainly, as jobs left, as the companies left, that sort of dried up the tax base.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on? Like, you know, government services are disappearing because the town was so dependent on revenue from like one giant source,
Hmm.
right? Is that sort of what happened, at least from the government side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely part of it. I think that, but I think that changes in government, local government services are probably smaller actually and less
Hmm.
obvious, at least in the field site that I'm talking about now in Minnesota. Um, the changes in government services were less salient to people I spoke to. I'll say that. That wasn't the thing they were noticing most. What they noticed most was that they used to live in communities where, you know, there were kids who went to middle school with new shoes every year, who were healthy, well fed. It
Hmm.
didn't feel like poverty was a major problem. Um, they used to live in communities where there were thriving local businesses, and those businesses, maybe they were clothing stores for the people who worked in the manufacturing jobs, but they were also
Hmm.
seed businesses for the because there used to be more people in agriculture, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Agribusiness has really changed that, and so it used to be, many more times the farmers per acre of land, and so they needed businesses to local businesses to you know go about their daily work, and those as farm agglomeration happened, those small farm businesses dried up, and then Walmart came and built a store on the
Yeah.
outskirts of town. And so you didn't need the local clothing shop. And then the manufacturing plant maybe left. And the kids who used to buy the new shoes every year at the clothing store, well, they're going to Walmart now, but also they don't have the money to buy new shoes every year. And people noticed
Yeah.
that. They noticed the feeling of like having resources just being sucked out of the community, right? It's this feeling of loss after loss after loss kind of compounding itself. And it was in this particular case really, really overwhelmingly present in the people with the conversations I had with folks. I never once asked somebody, do you feel like, your town might be dying? And the number of times people use the adjective dying to describe their
Yeah.
community, even in casual settings. I talk briefly in the book about how I, swim at the YMCA in the mornings, and two elderly folks with, asked me who I was and what I was doing there in the course of my time there. And both of them described the community as dying, just as like an introduction to the town. And so that feeling of the sort of more the private resources rather than the public resources being sucked out and drained away is really a powerful experience, I think, for a lot of residents.
So, I mean, like what you're describing, it sounds like these folks they're a victim of capital flight and
Yeah.
of the business cycle,
Yep.
and yet, um, correct me if I'm wrong. eh, I feel like our part of the country is like still gung ho for capitalism, or at least we talk about it that way, right? Like rah
Mhm.
rah, USA number one, and this is a capitalist country, right?
Mhm.
what's the disconnect? Why are folks not making
Yeah.
that leap and seeing the connection?
I think there's two things here. I think that some people, and this was certainly true of a lot of folks I spoke to actually in Indiana, who are really deeply worried about these problems, but they actually think there's a version of capitalism that will be what solves these problems. Maybe not this
Hmm.
version, but a version that will be what solves these problems. Because what they want is they want people to be able to afford to buy the new shoes for their kids every year. Like that's a version of capitalism, right?
Mm.
And they
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
if um, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can support the manufacturers to keep them in the United States, and so if we support business, then that will eventually trickle down to the workers. And that's obviously that's a viewpoint that's not limited to the Midwest in any way, shape, or form. That's a viewpoint
Yeah.
you could hear. If anyone listening to this went out on the street corner and asked, someone would say, "Yeah, that makes sense to me." But in this case in Minnesota that I'm talking about, that has really experienced this kind of severe loss that's so salient to residents. I wouldn't say there was an overwhelming feeling of support for capitalism. I would say there was an overwhelming feeling of like sorrow on the one hand over what they'd lost,
Mm.
which is just human, I think. Um, and then the political dimension of that was feeling like, maybe the government, rather than fixing what they'd lost, might be actually a threat to what they still have.
Mm.
And one reason I think people have put that link together. So you could imagine a world. I think what you're asking is sort of why don't they turn to the government then to say rein in capitalism, fix things for us? But I think the Republican Party particularly has done a really effective job of linking sort of big government and what they would call maybe socialist tendencies
Yeah.
to some of these negative outcomes that these communities are experiencing, and in particular arguing that bigger government doesn't help you or your community if you live in the small town Midwest. It's actually helping immigrants, it's actually helping urbanites in big cities,
Yeah.
and so government largesse is going everywhere except to you, and they're taking more of your resources, more tax dollars, and it's all at your expense and you're not seeing any of the benefit. And just to kind of further answer your question about what's the disconnect there, you know, we know that it's really hard for Americans to see how the government is directly benefiting them.
Yeah.
And that's not a Midwestern thing. That's not a small town thing. That's just,
Yeah.
we don't understand. We don't have a good, it's partly how our public policies are constructed. We just can't see how the government is benefiting us. So when you are watching all this, and then imagine you're in this place where you've lost 20% of the population of the community in the last 40 years, this massive loss. So you know administrations have changed, they've gone from Democrat to Republican, the government's maybe gotten a little bigger, less big, smaller, none of
Yeah.
that has stemmed this flow in your community. So it's really easy then to say, okay, rather than envisioning this sort of big, bold solution that involves more government or reining in of capitalism, what I want to do is just stave off any future further threat to what I have left. I want to protect what I have. And I think that's where the Republican Party in the last maybe 15 years has really gotten the comparative advantage in these communities, is saying we will be the people to keep away that further threat. And I think it's
Yeah.
really effective.
So I mean, but it's trickery. I mean, they're lying. Like the Republicans are very good at branding and telling a story and playing on one's emotions. But like in your book, you're not saying that voters here in the Midwest are like duped. I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
We're not.
No.
We're making choices that we think are the right choices. They're that we think are rooted in agency and dignity. But like, how do we square that with the fact that like these choices have kept producing worse and worse outcomes in a lot of these towns?
Yeah. No, listen, I think, you asked me over email kind of what is one thing that I think people get wrong about Midwestern politics, maybe. And I think that that's kind of the narrative that is the narrative that really put the bee in my bonnet that kind of like got me kicking on this
Yeah.
project in a lot of ways
Voting
is that
against their own interests, right?
voting against their own interests. I cannot tell you how much I hate that phrase. Um, so let me just, if you don't mind, I'll back up a second. So
Please.
we don't really know how anyone in America thinks about their self interest when they vote.
Yeah.
And in the last so during a brief period in the 1930s and 40s when we had FDR and he was responding to the New Deal and he was expanding the welfare state and he was giving us big government, we had something that looked like class politics, right? We had
Hmm.
working class voters throughout these industrialized cities in the Midwest joining unions, storming into the Democratic coalition, and we had middle class voters and business people sort of becoming the bedrock of the Republican Party. That looks like class politics. That looks like what people are thinking of when they talk about self
Yeah.
interest. It's workers voting for the party that's going to put in protections for working class communities, that they're going to provide services for people who are down on their luck, that makes sense according to our self-interest. But that was just about, maximum 30, 40 years in American politics. Like we
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
looked like that, right? And so since then, we know that people don't generally vote according to their pocketbook. Like if they're unemployed, should they vote out the president who, was presiding over the spike in unemployment? Well, that could be
Mhm.
self-interest, but they're not doing that. Um, and we also know that increasingly over, since the late 1960s, that link between class and party politics has deteriorated. So nowadays there's this really, really tight correlation between college education and affiliating with the Democratic Party, and non-college education and affiliating with the Republican Party. Um, and a slightly less tight link between high income and Democratic voting and low income and Republican voting. But so that's almost the exact opposite of what we had
Yeah.
during that earlier period, right? So all of those rich people are also voting against their self-interest, but we don't talk about them. And so I just don't think there is such a thing as voting against your self-interest. I think everyone is making decisions about politics um, using the information available to them and responding to, I think, their real lived experiences and trying to figure out, well, which party is more likely to kind of represent my concerns and my kind of people. And everyone's doing that same thing, whether they're in the Midwest or they're in the Northeast or on the
Yeah.
West Coast. And so I think to me, like once you start, at least my experience was that once I started talking to people, their politics always made sense to me, you
Yeah.
know? Um, because they explain it to you and you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And they think about their self-interest in a different way, right? So in this
Yeah.
Minnesota town, they're thinking about their interest in like trying to save the community, and they think the Republican Party is going to provide an answer for that. And the reason I don't think that that's like a trickery or like a pulling the wool over their eyes is that when you like I said, like 40 years of population decline in this community, right? No administration has fixed that for them. No
Yeah.
different governor of Minnesota has fixed that for them. And so why should we say it's wrong for them to think the Republicans now could, right? And maybe down the line, after giving that a try, they've been voting Democrat for 6 years. That hasn't worked. They're trying something else. And maybe they'll come back, or maybe they'll just stop voting entirely, which would be a shame. But the idea of people being tricked or duped, I think, is really like harmful. And yeah, and I think everyone makes decisions about politics the exact same way, regardless of where they live or who they are or how much money they have.
Yeah. Yeah. It really, it's infantilizing, I think, in a
Yeah.
way, to suggest that, oh, those simple Midwestern folks, they're so easily dupable.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, no, I mean, you're voting in your own self. Maybe your own self interest isn't what some folks think it would be. Um, I think there's a general kind of cynicism out here about the parties, like vis-a-vis economics. Like, oh well,
Right.
they're both in the pocket of big business, at least say these Republicans are gonna give us a win in like on these cultural issues
Yeah.
that we believe in.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's totally part of it. I think um, you know, we were talking about capitalism before, and right now we're seeing a Republican president who is sort of reversing decades, obviously, of America's sort of increasing commitment to free trade. Um, and I'm not an economist, and so I don't really have anything to say about what the consequences of that will be. Um, but I would say that's very, very different from what Republican presidents and Republican
Yeah,
Party elected officials have done in the past. And now Democrats, are the party of free trade, and they really have been since Bill Clinton. And has that been great for like formerly industrial cities in the heartland? No. And so I think that it's not just the case that people have changed parties since the New Deal. It's also the case that the parties have dramatically changed since the New Deal. And
yeah,
you mentioned these cultural issues, and so sometimes I think of them as cultural issues, but sometimes I think of them just as like fundamentally what the parties mean and what they stand for to people. And so, since the 1960s, there have been these, new racial divisions in the political parties,
yeah.
right? That the most people view the Democrats as the party to represent Black Americans, and Republicans as not that party, right? And then there are these new religious divisions since the 1980s. People tend to view the Republicans as the party to represent Christians, particularly conservative Christians, and the Democrats don't represent that. They may represent a more secular viewpoint. And so even if it's not about a particular issue like abortion or civil rights, when you see a party that looks like you, that represents, like talks like you, that has other people
Yeah.
who are like you, who are more Midwestern, who maybe never worked on a farm, to your point, but who maybe still own some acres that they lease to big farmers, who at least have had those experiences. You are more drawn to that party than the party where you see, okay, it's a lot of like atheists who live in New York City. If that's what you think of as the Democratic Party, that doesn't really feel like that's the party for you. So yeah, and then their policies have often further exacerbated those perceptions by favoring economic policies that are good for growth in the aggregate, but not good for growth in certain communities, and then also favoring more of these like cultural policies that that kind of celebrate things like atheism. That might be really, really anathema to someone for whom Christianity is like central to who they are as a person, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think you're saying, as you say in the book, most of these folks hold progressive economic views, even as they're voting Republican, right? They're voting on different issues than the pocketbook issues. Why hasn't the Democratic Party been able to capitalize on that? It's like sitting right there. Like, are we talking about the wrong things?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I answered this question really unsatisfactorily about 20 times in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election. But I'll try again for you. So,
Getting the
so yeah.
refined stuff here, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Listen, I think that people's views of the economy and of which party is going to kind of fix the economy for them um, are really rooted in those like pretty localized lived experiences, right? So I always use the example. I'm writing a new book now about affluent coastal suburbs, like the exact opposite sort of context that I was spending time in
Interesting.
for this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when I first started interviewing folks in the Bay Area and California about like local politics and potential opportunities for growth, I kept hearing that no one wanted this in this particular town wanted any new development in the downtown area. The downtown kind of didn't exist. And there had been various plans over the years to try to create this downtown and, put in little local businesses and restaurants, things like that. And everyone was like, I like that we're a sleepy community. We want it to stay a sleepy community. And this was shocking to me, having just come out of the years I spent talking to, thinking about, and writing about these Midwestern communities where every single community leader I spoke to was trying to figure out how to lure in any business at all times, any business, any development, anything. The idea was like, we will, they were making it so easy with every resource they had for any employer to come in, for any housing developer to come in, anybody to come in and breathe sort
Yeah.
of new life, new tax revenue, to your earlier point, into the community. And so those experiences of those preferences about local growth have to do with their experience of the economy, right? If you think the economy is like hanging by a thread, you'll take any opportunity for growth and development. This is what was happening in my Midwestern cases. If you think the economy is booming and all you've seen is growth, 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 and people getting richer, 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 that's the Bay Area in the last 30 years. It has been
Yeah.
boom times, right? And so they are in an embarrassment of riches and they're like, we don't want any more growth. And so those experiences are so powerful in shaping people's thoughts about the economy. And also, it turns
Yeah.
out, about which party is going to fix that economy for them. And I think it's really hard for like a politician to kind of change those experiences with rhetoric. This kept coming up, I think, in the 2024 election, particularly because, people would refer to Joe Biden as the most pro-union president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal. And I agree with that assessment. And they would ask,
Not a very high bar. Yeah.
yes, actually, that's the point we should be making. But yeah, but they would ask, like, why has that not helped him then with union workers or with the working classes more broadly? And I was like, I just think that those folks have already for years, many of them, written off the Democrats as the party that's going to fix, that's going to be for them. They have
Yeah.
had totally different experiences of struggle and decline and feeling abandoned, as you said earlier, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican in office. And so nothing that's happened in the last year is going to fix that this quickly. It really has to be about, I think, revitalizing those communities.
I think about a town like Springfield, Ohio,
Okay.
which is one of these kind of Midwestern towns that has had a declining population, maybe saw, some capital flight, factories leaving and whatnot. And they did a thing to grow their population, inviting in immigrants, and it was generally working out
Yeah.
quite well. But then you get this um, drummed up cultural backlash to that. How do we how do we thread that needle? Because like there is a solution. It's staring us right in the face. We want to grow
Mhm.
these communities. It's like you throw the doors wide open and say, "Welcome, welcome, immigrants. Please bring us your good food."
It's funny you say that. I was talking to my in-laws this weekend who are British, and I was saying, yeah, there's not great food in your country, and there's only great food in our country because we've been a melting pot since the founding, and so we have great food from all over the world, and so that's why food here is typically amazing.
Oh, if we
Um,
didn't have immigrants, it would just be beans on toast for every meal.
yeah, pretty much. So yeah, as the granddaughter of Italian immigrants, I'm thankful for that. Um, but yeah, so I think a couple things. One is that so there's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem, I think, in some of these contexts. So in one of my field
Yeah.
sites, there has been a massive growth in the immigrant population, and it has been like it was in Springfield before this kerfuffle kind of emerged last year. The sort of white native born folks have been, I think, have felt like these newcomers are essential to the economy, that they are kind of nice Christian family people. A lot of them go to the Catholic Church. That's a really big church and on the center of town. And in a
Hmm.
lot of ways, in that sense, fit right in with this very Christian community. And most of the folks I interviewed who were native born residents were very clear that, if ICE were to sweep through and do a mass deportation of everyone who didn't have documents, that their town would just like grind to a halt at this point in time, that they were so dependent on immigration. But the chicken and the egg problem there is that those immigrants moved to that community because they'd already sort of rebuilt their employment base and their economic
Mm.
foundation. Um, and now the employers there um, need new employees. They need, as you said, more immigrants. Um, and so they are, I imagine, some of those employers who are lobbying the current administration to say, please don't deport our workers. Please still make it possible for new workers to come in. The economy depends on immigrant labor. But like I said, it's a chicken and an egg problem. If you throw open the doors to immigrants in a context where people already feel that there aren't enough jobs for the folks who live there, I don't think that that's a recipe for success.
Any of the towns you profile dealing with immigrant influx or just accommodating new kind of folks moving into their communities?
Yeah, the town in Indiana that I was just describing, that they where the immigrants go to the Catholic Church.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. So and that has been, like I said, it's gone very well. Like when I talk to um well, I mean, gone very well. There's a lot of things I could say, but I guess what I mean to say is it's not the case that like the native born white folks have these, you like hate the immigrants and are trying to get rid of
Hmm.
them. It's not the sort of Springfield, Ohio example that you gave. It's actually, I would talk to people who, for example, might be people who watch Fox News, and they would tell me, I I want a wall. I want to prevent criminals from coming into this country, yada, yada. And then I would ask them about and they would have this sort of stereotypical view of um, a Latino immigrant coming over the border and who was a
Yeah, they're all
criminal.
MS-13, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But then, sort of as we would continue that conversation, I would ask them more about the immigrants in their community who are largely from Mexico and Central America. And they would say, yeah, no, folks around here are amazing. You just see them walking around town with their cute little kids. They go to church on Sunday. They're so much more hardworking than like the losers who come out of our high school. Like, they're just here working hard. And then they would say, I sometimes read the crime blotter in the local newspaper on Sundays, and it's always the Caucasians who are getting arrested for all of these crimes. You never see a Latino name in the police blotter. And so the image of the sort of immigrants living in their community was really counteracting this other image that they were getting from the national media, which is these folks are bad. And what they were seeing was like, actually, they do a lot of good things for our community, and they don't really conform to those stereotypical images. They were holding both in their minds rather than
Yeah.
just holding the one in their mind.
So like the people I know, they're the good ones. We got the good seeds here, but
Yeah.
all those other people right over there, they're still the problem. Even though it's like, no, this is just another group of people who are going to go and live in another city similar to yours somewhere else, and make that town more vibrant and livable.
Yeah. But I think that honestly, when I would have those conversations with people in this town in Indiana where there was so much immigration, one of the most common opinions I heard was that people wanted to build a wall, and they also wanted a pathway to citizenship for everyone who was in
Mm,
the country without documents, but who hadn't committed any other kind of crime. Um, and that is actually, I think, part of one of the immigration compromises that has been floated at the policy level. And I think it appeals to people in communities like this. I mean, I think it appeals to a broader set of people. But one reason I think it appeals to people in this community is that they sense that there is some kind of disorder and mayhem at the border that's like a real problem. And
yeah,
there's
yeah.
this border dimension to the crisis. and fixing that with a wall or more border security, whatever it might be, but they want to address that. When they talk about immigration restrictions in the broad sense, though, they don't mean, they don't want mass deportation. They don't want, um, to take, separate families and children. They want order at the border, and then they wanted the people who, like the people in their community who'd been hardworking and had been taking their kids to church and all these things. They want those people to continue to be able to contribute to whatever community they live in. And so, actually, this experience of living in a town with immigrants created, I think, this opportunity for like a real political compromise between the left and the right on an issue like immigration. But obviously, I mean, that political compromise has not emerged, but it was an opinion that I wouldn't have expected to hear given how polarized American politics is. I expected people to say, I want immigration restriction on all dimensions, or I want immigration liberalism on all dimensions. And that's just not what I was hearing.
So, yeah, I think most folks really are welcoming and in favor of legal immigration, and I think the illegal immigration portion of things is widely over exaggerated, for, to scare people for the sake of fear.
Yeah, sure.
Is there an opening in places like this for social democratic ideas to
Hmm.
take hold? That's the way I'm coming from things. I'm
Right.
coming from like the democratic socialist perspective. Um, is there room in these, communities that the residents said are dying to be revitalized with a little, little socialism, even if you don't call it that?
Sure. Listen, I think so. I mean, one of the points that I make in the book is that, and this is another thing that I think people get really wrong about Midwestern politics. Like you said, not everyone lives on a farm, but also not all of these cities are similar, but they are also very, very different. Like,
Hmm.
Wisconsin is different from Minnesota, is different from Indiana, is different from Illinois. They are different. The towns in those states are different. People's politics are different. And we know that. And I think that oftentimes we kind of paint the whole region with
Oh yeah.
a brush. And so in the book, I try to draw out different trends in the politics of these kind of white post industrial cities that I'm studying. And what I show is that a very large portion of them that had once been part of this kind of Democratic coalition during the New Deal, about 2/3 of them had already shifted to the right by the late 1960s. That was true of my Indiana case.
Ah.
Those 2/3 are probably not shifting to the left, as long as sort of Christianity is such a kind of key dividing line in American politics, as long as Christianity and race are such key dividing lines in American politics. The other third have shifted to the right much later. Um, and some of them have not shifted to the right. And so I think that third, where people aren't, and also people vote Republican and vote Democrat for different reasons, right? So though
Yeah.
that 2/3 probably are voted Republican then and now for reasons that have to do with Christianity and their
Yeah.
perceptions of the Democratic Party as the party of people of color when they are not people of color, for those reasons, right? So economic policy isn't like factoring hugely into their current politics. But in those other contexts, economics are factoring into their politics. And so there, people are more likely to be voting Democrat or Republican because of their experiences in the economy. And I think that's where you have more of not a window of opportunity to kind of bring people to a social democratic perspective. And what I would say there is what my kind of answer was at the beginning is that I think that organized labor has to be a big piece of that. Organized labor has not always been a progressive force in American politics. It's often been
Yeah.
anti-immigrant, um, anti-woman kind of. Um, and so I think in recent years, they worked really hard to change that. But I think that because of declines in their membership and their resources, not I think, but the evidence suggests that unions, for the most part, have not been doing the kind of like on the ground mobilizing work that they used to do. They're not
Yeah.
really expanding their reach. They are, frankly, based on my interviews with union leaders, spending a lot of time arguing in collective bargaining about healthcare costs, which is super important. Healthcare costs have exploded, but they're
Hmm.
not even getting really major wage gains, right?
Yeah.
And so people rarely think about unions anymore as this sort of working class organization trying to lift up the workers in this capitalist system, but they used to. And I think in this one case of mine in Wisconsin, they still do think that way. And I think that's
Yeah,
really
you said that was one of the big differences in these towns that you profiled is the degree of union involvement
right.
is a big indicator of where these towns are going to go.
Right.
Is that a right to work state issue,
Hmm.
states like Indiana are openly hostile to unions. I know Wisconsin, there was a big thing with Scott Walker about a
Right.
decade ago, hostility to like public sector unions. Is that sort of driving some of this difference?
Hmm. No, I absolutely think so. Unionization has declined much faster across Indiana than in either
Yeah,
Minnesota or Wisconsin, precisely because of right to work, probably, and other, I would say, other signals that Indiana politicians support employers to be aggressive towards organized labor.
yeah,
Right. So yeah, I think state level policy is huge here, but that's also, I mean, that should give us kind of some hope because that's a lever we can pull, or it's a lever that activists and civil society can pull to try and rebuild the labor movement is operating when, when Congress feels like it's on lockdown. We still have states and we still
yeah,
have cities, and local governments can also do a lot to help support organized labor. They obviously can't um, they can't change right to work policies, but they
right.
can do things like sign, project labor agreements. They can hire union labor to build a new city hall. And in this one
Yeah,
field site of mine in Wisconsin, those were the kinds of things they were doing to support the labor movement. And so the labor movement was still really actively engaged in politics, and that mattered for the politics of other residents. They felt there like unions in the Democratic Party are still kind of working towards providing something, maybe not like a social democratic vision, but something like
sure.
that in that direction. And I think when you don't have that kind of political mobilization by organized labor, it's really hard to rebuild that perspective. I think it has to happen from the ground. I really think it has to happen from the ground up, which is a tough, tough answer. But if people want to build a social democratic sort of support in these contexts, I think it has to do with revitalizing those communities and helping build an organizational infrastructure that supports that kind of worldview.
Yeah, yeah. It's like we sort of have some structures there, like in the Democratic Party, which maybe doesn't always do what we want. Like also organized labor. I just talked to Eric Blanc recently
Mm,
about this very thing, and
mm,
how this is another like nexus of power that's sort of not been used as well as it could have over the last four or 5 decades or so, right?
yes, yes,
So,
totally.
um, if you can get across one message to Democratic leaders or left organizers about um, voters in the heartland
Hmm.
and organizing us to advocate for that kind of uh, social democratic society we would like to see, what's the one message you want to make sure we all take away from this interview and from your book?
Can I give you two? They'll be quick.
Of course.
Two quick
Yeah.
ones. Um,
No, absolutely not.
the first one is definitely for sure supporting organized labor. And I think Joe Biden got that, and that's what he was doing. And I worry that because, he performed particularly poorly with the working class in 2024, that Democrats will abandon that agenda. And I think that would be so wrong footed. That is an agenda that will rebuild communities and will reduce economic inequality, will help workers, and very downstream from that in a long time could also help Democratic candidates and the social democratic perspective you're talking about. And so I think it would be a huge mistake for Democrats to back away from that agenda. And it has been a huge mistake that they backed away from support of organized labor
Yep.
over the past several decades. That's point one. Point two, I would say, building off of that, is that I think Democratic officials get really frustrated by things like what happened with Joe Biden in the fall. Like they kept saying the economy is good. Joe Biden has been great for the economy. Don't you guys get it? And as I said before,
Number go
you
up. Number go up. Why
know,
aren't you happy? Number up.
exactly.
Yes.
And I think that that comes across as condescending and frankly kind of obnoxious if you're living in a community where the number has always gone down, right?
Yeah. Our
Um,
number not go up.
right. And so, I don't think it's possible to solve this problem with rhetoric. I think it involves real organizing on the ground and policies that support that organizing.
Wow. Yeah, there's no magic bullet, is there?
No.
Well, so you already said you're working on the next book.
Yes.
When are we going to be on the lookout for that one?
Oh my gosh, Scott, that's the scariest question you could ask me right now. A
Yeah, the
couple more
publisher
years.
says the same thing.
Yeah, a couple more years, but hopefully not too long.
Very good. And where can our listeners and viewers find more from you?
You can find me at my website, which is stephanieternullo.com. I'm also on Blue Sky. I think it's at Stephanie Ternullo. And yeah, on Harvard's website, I'm pretty findable.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you so much joining me here today. Fantastic conversation, and can't wait to hear more from you in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Scott.
I really appreciate it. Once again, that was Stephanie Ternullo, Assistant Professor of Government at the Harvard University Kennedy School and author of How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics. Now, normally, I'd have an essay here with takeaways from the interview, but I'm going to try something different. In order to keep a steady stream of content coming your way, I'm going to experiment with releasing the essay separately a couple days after the interview drops. My tentative plan going forward is to release new interviews on Tuesdays, with the essay coming out Thursday or Friday. Then, beginning on May 18th, I will be hosting a live Sunday morning talk show featuring a panel of guests from around the state. I love the deep dives on a single topic that I get to do on this podcast, but I also want to talk more about current events in Indiana with a diverse group of Hoosiers. The network Sunday shows out of Indianapolis are okay, but half the time is wasted on bad faith MAGA talking points with pushback from a very narrow section of the Democratic Big Tent. Who's Left this week will bring together panelists from the Democratic Socialist left to the principled never-Trump conservatives. By removing the bad faith arguments, my hope is that we can demonstrate the full range of what is possible in our state once we come to our senses and toss these bums out of office. Again, that will be live every Sunday morning beginning May 18th. Stay tuned for more details. What do you think? Let us know. Reach out on social media. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and on most other social media sites at ScottRodge78. You can also email me at scott@whosleft.us. Thanks again to our guest, Dr. Stephanie Ternullo. More from her at stephanieternullo.com. The book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics, is available from Princeton University Press. Links are in the show notes. And after you rush to buy Stephanie's book, if your budget allows and you value my work, please consider a paid subscription over at whosleft.us, where you can find every episode and article we've ever published. Hit me up on social media with your feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns, and please forward the show to a friend and have them pass it on. Let's keep building this project and a truly democratic state, one conversation at a time. Until the next one, this has been the Who's Left podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.